Yo, what's up, y'all? It's John Miller, and this is not exactly How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. And I'm saying it that way because this is a little different from what I've been doing. It's something that I have been thinking about doing for quite some time. I've gone through a lot of history stuff over the past year. For anybody who's been watching, you know what I mean. I've covered pretty exhaustively the pre-Columbian period, and I've gone all the way up to the end of the War of 1812. I'm recording stuff that has to do with the period 1815 to 1845, so that's upcoming. And if you like that stuff, if you're into what I'm doing there, that is not going away. That is going to stay the same. But this is a piece of what I always envisioned doing with this. And that is to kind of take what I have learned over the many years that I have taught and read about and tried to understand historical developments and see the ways in which the things I've learned have helped me to understand the world as it is now. Because I think that is one of the most valuable pieces of historical knowledge. So this aspect of the channel, of the podcast, is going to be me talking about things that are going on currently and what I think we can glean from what has gone on historically. A lot of it is going to be my opinion. And look, if you're not interested in what I think, if you don't give a shit about my opinion, then maybe this isn't for you. And that's fine. There is certainly no shortage in the world of people offering their points of view online, in social media, on YouTube, on television, whatever. I have a very strong aversion to the whole hot take culture that has kind of infected just about every aspect of modern media. There seems to be an appetite for volume over substance. And this isn't just in politics, news, that kind of thing. There's plenty of it in that world, and I really hate all of it. I can tell when it's stupid and poorly thought out and just trying to rile people up. And not only do I find that kind of thing repulsive personally, it screams to me of somebody who doesn't give a damn about the truth or about nuance or about complexity and is just trying to get earballs and eyeballs. But I hate it because of what it does to the discourse, because of the fact that it shrinks people's patience and point of view and perspective down to the lowest common denominator for everything. It's a big part of the reason, in my view, that we can't talk to each other anymore. You know? I mean, everybody kind of stakes out their side of the argument, plants their flag, and it gets to the point where in the political realm now, it's become like team sports, for fuck's sake. You know? I mean, it's like, I'm team red, I'm team blue, and whatever my team does is great, and whatever your team does sucks, and you've got the worst motivations in the world, and everything you have to say is tainted, and all my guys are pure as the driven snow. I know that explanations for complicated phenomena can't be boiled down to something that somebody's going to say in 30 or 60 seconds. That's just not possible. If you spend any time studying history or social sciences writ large, you tend to find just how often there are so many variables that become a part of particular outcomes that it's impossible to tease apart one cause and effect. You can't say A caused B and now we have C. It's just almost never that simple. Like, say, I don't know, the Iraq War of 2003 or the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Those are just some common examples that you'll hear people over and over again try to say that it's one reason that those things happen, and it's just not true. I am going to try to bring some historical perspective to things as they currently are. And one of the things that I want to talk about immediately today for the first time is the way in which looking at things historically can be valuable, what is possible to achieve with historical thinking. So there is a wide variety of historical thinking. Historians disagree with each other all the time about stuff. I heard one historian, and I can't remember what podcast I was listening to, the person that was interviewing this historian said, well, do you think that there's a pendulum? Do things swing back and forth? Does history repeat itself? And this historian, this guy, flat out rejected that idea, which I found to be kind of stunning. Because to me, there very much are patterns. Look, if you say history repeats itself in a room full of historians, you probably get like half of them faint and half of them lose their shit and start yelling at you about how that's not accurate. I think it's because the historians, when they hear somebody say history repeats itself, they think that you're saying things unfold exactly as they once did in the past. And that is not ever how I've understood that expression. I have heard historians say that history doesn't repeat itself, but there are echoes, or history doesn't repeat itself, but there are ripples, or whatever other natural metaphor you want to use to say that things that happen in the past do have reflections, hints of what once was occurring in the present. I am somebody who very much believes that. I think we can discover things and learn from those experiences and anticipate what may come in the future. By way of example, I was an undergraduate in college when the second Iraq War happened. And one of the classes that I took in college that really kind of flipped my lid, really just blew my mind, was this history of the Vietnam War class. It went intimately into the details of how the war got started. For those of you that don't know, the United States was involved in Vietnam long before the 1960s. There's a whole series of events that lead to the United States getting enmeshed in Vietnam, which the Vietnam War, I would say pretty comfortably, is one of the greatest disasters of American history. Perhaps only exceeded by the Iraq War of 2003 to 2010, 11? I mean, it depends on how you define when it's over. The whole time that the Bush administration was talking about invading Iraq and liberating it and installing a new government, I kept thinking about Vietnam, and it's like, have you motherfuckers never opened a history book ever? When does this ever work? When does a foreign country with a totally different culture, both, culturally, like in terms of how people live and the values they have and the way they dress and the music they listen to and what they eat and all that kind of stuff, and a totally, completely different political culture, when has an outside force that has a completely different cultural landscape politically and just about every other way come into a foreign place, knocked out the current government, set up a new one, and it went swimmingly? When has that ever happened? I couldn't come up with an example, and this is something that we tried to do in Vietnam. And the whole time I was thinking, this is going to be a fucking disaster. And guess what? It was a fucking disaster. Okay? It has, to a large extent, I guess I would say you can trace the current political environment to 9/11, the overreaction to it, the invasion of Iraq, and the way that totally disenchanted a generation of people, the same way, by the way, that Vietnam did. So there, right there, is a pattern for you, okay? I tend to believe that these historical patterns are meaningful, they exist, there is a pendulum, it does swing back and forth, but full disclosure, there are a lot of historians who are smarter than I am, who are better schooled in history than I am, who disagree with that idea. So I'll lay out my case and leave it for any of you who listen to this to judge whether you agree with me or whether you agree with people who say, John, you're full of shit. The way I would lay it out is like this. If you look at the grand scope of American history, there is a history of pendulum swings, of things that happen, big events, whether it's wars or political movements or the growth of the market economy or industrialization and then deindustrialization or whatever it is, that create certain political dynamics. Those political dynamics take root. They usually go a little too far at some point. The people who are at the tip of the spear or who are leading the charge in those political movements believe that their power politically, their influence is not ephemeral, but is in fact permanent, and they're going to be able to reign for 1,000 years. That kind of mindset. They go too far, and people on the other side react to it, and you have a swing back in the other direction. Modern political scientists refer to this dynamic as the thermostatic reaction of public opinion. That is to say that public opinion acts like a thermostat. When things go in a particular direction, it gets too hot, quote unquote, the air conditioner kicks on and things start to cool down a little bit. When it gets too cold, the heat kicks on because it's become too cold and things have gone too far in that direction. And that seems very cogent to me. And here's why. I'm going to go through sort of like the grand scope of U.S. history here very briefly and just explain the swings that I have observed and what I've learned. I'm going to start at the American Revolution because it is a dramatic thing. Of course, it's the beginning of the United States as an independent country. And there is this big immediate reaction at that time against centralized authority, like the King of England, like the Parliament, and against the upper classes and the intellectuals and so forth. And that manifests itself in terms of these very, very, very democratic movements in mostly the states. The national government that is formed at the time, the Articles of Confederation government, is extremely weak. There's not even an executive in the Articles government. There's just a legislature, basically. And the states have a lot more power. The states, their governments are seen as closer to the people, and the average folks in those states have a lot more power. You can kind of trace all of this to the fact that there is this big reaction against centralized authority manifested in the form of the British monarchy and the British Parliament. Okay, but as a piece of this, you have, in the view of a lot of people, a movement that goes too far. And you end up with laws being passed left and right that are designed to benefit the common folk. And do that in some sense, but also create some chaos. Probably the best examples of those kinds of things are laws that repudiate debt and that have the states starting to just print money because there are a lot of people in economic distress after the revolution is over. Of course, once you start printing money, you get a lot of inflation. And you also ended up having things like Shays Rebellion. And that's just one example of a number of things like Shays Rebellion that happened where there's a popular uprising because common people feel like they're being screwed over. They feel like they're not getting the government, the financial situation, the economic situation that they thought they were going to get. And there's a legitimate gripe there. The economy did take a big nosedive, or I don't know about a big nosedive, but a pretty steep decline in the years immediately following the revolution, as is pretty common historically after wars are over and demand drops because the war is no longer on and the government doesn't need as much stuff as it did. Plus, the United States was in all this debt, and people, average people, were having to pay a lot more taxes to try to cope with that debt. Most average farmers didn't have access to cash, and they could not pay those debts, and a lot of them had their farms repossessed. That's what sparked Shays Rebellion. And there are other events, as I said, like that. People in various states saw Shays Rebellion, saw that these common people were seizing control of courts, refusing to have foreclosure notices serviced, and they saw that as anarchy. I think that's an understandable point of view to have. And so you get this conservative reaction that creates the federal government, the new constitution, new back then. It's still the same constitution that we have now, that granted a great deal more central authority to the national government, and that limited democracy in some pretty significant ways, because the only branch of the government that was democratically elected in any sense was the legislative branch, and that was just the House. And still, at that point, shortly after the Constitution was ratified, a lot of people don't have the vote. So the reaction to this push for democracy and all the quote-unquote chaos that guys like Hamilton really objected to was a system in which the federal government got a lot more control, things became much less democratic, and the upper classes got greater control. There's a reaction to this pretty much immediately after it happens. And there's a push against the snooty federalists and the genteel classes, the intellectuals like Hamilton, John Adams, John Jay, those sorts of guys who believed that it was the duty of the upper classes, the well-educated types, the wealthy types, to govern on behalf of everyone else. This is something I've talked about in previous episodes, and there's a pushback against that. And things become much, much more democratic. Thomas Jefferson kind of leads the charge in that direction because he's one of the elites who does not believe in this notion that the republic is meant to be governed by the intellectual and economic elites of the United States. And that goes on for quite some time. And the political environment becomes more pro-states' rights, less power for the federal government. Jefferson, and to a lesser extent Madison, shrink the size of the federal government pretty significantly. People all over the United States are pushing for more democracy, to get rid of property requirements for voting, to have universal white manhood suffrage. And it's pretty limiting by today's standards, of course, but that was seen as very progressive at the time, right? So there's another pendulum swing, okay? In the years after the War of 1812, there is this push against the states' rights and diminishing power of the federal government because the experience of the War of 1812 awakened a lot of folks to the fact that the federal government was not in a great position to fight against the British or to carry on things of great national import. And there is this nascent nationalism that breaks out where people kind of, at least for a time, stop thinking of themselves as Virginians and New Yorkers and Ohioans and Kentuckians and whatever, and start thinking of themselves more as Americans. And there's a push for expansion of the federal government into creating infrastructure to more effectively link parts of the country together and foster internal economic activity. So that's kind of a pendulum swing back in the other direction. And there are lots and lots more examples of this. The period just after that becomes a more pro-states' rights period in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, leading up to eventually the Civil War, right? There's a huge sectional rift, mostly over slavery, but also over tariffs and other things. There's a push for westward expansion, possibly the expansion of slavery. And the states' rights thing and the sectional disputes pushes aside the nationalism of the 18-teens, 1820s. So there's a pendulum swing. Then the Civil War happens, and the push is to unify the federal government and to give greater power to the federal government. Lincoln tremendously expanded executive authority and the authority of the federal government because he kind of had to in the crucible of war to keep the nation, the country together as one thing rather than splitting into at least a couple different countries, because that's what the southern states wanted to do. There is a strengthening of the federal government in that period. You have the post-Civil War Reconstruction amendments that are put together, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, which for the most part seek to impart civil rights onto freedmen, former slaves, and it's men, not women. There's a lot of women that get really pissed off about that because a lot of women had become big crusaders in the abolitionist movement, and they were really, really, really pissed off that they did not get the vote along with non-white men via the 15th Amendment. And there's this push in the 1860s and 70s and into the 80s a little bit to really try to make freedmen equal citizens. But it doesn't last. There's a push back. And you get this whole period in the 1880s, 1890s, and really through, I would say, the 1930s, where southern states take over and are repressing the freedoms, the privileges of non-white people, mostly African Americans, because the vast majority of African Americans lived in the southern states until the Great Migration begins in the World War I era and really gets ramped up during the Depression and World War II. That's the exodus of African Americans out of the southern states and into the Midwest, the Northeast, and the West. That is a reaction to the push for civil rights in the 1860s, 70s, 80s. There's this pendulum swing back to repression of civil rights, and you've got Jim Crow and the Black Codes and the horror of violent intimidation via lynching, right? That's a pendulum swing. You've also got in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and really through the very first years of the 1900s, this big pro-business environment where the trusts, the big oil trusts like Standard Oil and the railroad trusts and Carnegie Steel, later U.S. Steel, coming to dominate the economic landscape. And it's all about laissez-faire and free market and the government shrinks away both the federal and, well, some state governments try to regulate some of these big companies, but they're mostly knocked down in the courts, and the big companies kind of get to do whatever they want, and rich folks get to do kind of whatever they want. But all that creates a backlash, and there is this push for greater regulation of businesses, of the economy, and taxation to try to make things a little bit more equal. It's when you get the income tax as put into place by the 16th Amendment. And that is the progressive era. That is a backlash against what is often referred to as the Gilded Age, the late 1800s, when you have laissez-faire, free market, businesses get to do whatever they want. Then you get this crackdown on big businesses and wealthy individuals and a lot more government regulation. Theodore Roosevelt leads the charge there, but for basically a 20-year period, the first 20 years of the 20th century, you get a government that is cracking down on business and regulating the economy. That leads to a backlash, especially because of America's participation in World War I. And people are saying, enough of this progressive bullshit. I'm sick of the government getting up in everybody's business. And you get the 1920s, another period of laissez-faire, back off, hey, let big business and individuals do what they want. And a lot of the reforms created by the progressives are either ignored or not enforced or whatever. And that creates a volatile economic situation, which eventually results in the Great Depression. And you get another expansion of government. So I hope at this point you're kind of seeing what I'm talking about. To my mind, the pendulum swings are undeniable. One of the great lessons to me that I take away from this is that there will always be pendulum swings. There will be a surge in a particular movement, followed by a backlash, followed by the resurgence of its opposite. And I only went through some of it there. I didn't get into the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century and beyond, but that continues. I could give you other examples, and I'm seeing it right now. That's the thing. It happens, and this is true, kind of like technology in my mind. Like technology tends to speed up. The development of new technologies comes faster and faster as we get better and better at other technologies. Well, historical trends seem to move a lot faster. And the dominance of one movement doesn't last as long, and the backlash comes a lot faster, and then the, if not opposite, at least opposed point of view becomes dominant and gets to institute its way of being. So, I hope you found this interesting and useful. I think this is something I'm going to do once a week or so. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how people respond to this. And I'm going to get into, now that I've kind of laid out the basics of what I think this is going to be, I'm going to get into particular stories, particular developments in government, in politics, and economics that I am seeing historical parallels to from the things that I have studied. So if it interests you, I hope you'll tune in. I hope you found, as I said, this particular episode to be useful. I hope you found the information in here intriguing, and I hope you'll join me because I think it's going to be interesting. Thanks very much. Take care, and I will see you next time.